Now, to get started, the last section in Chapter 7 specifically does go over the Supreme Court. This is something that we have touched on before in other chapters and other sections, but we will go into just a little bit more detail. For instance, we will cover judicial review, some of the checks on the Supreme Court's power, because we do have the separation of power and checks and balances. But first, just like any other class, I want to start with the bell ringer. Can you describe the 3 levels of the federal court system? This is something that we have gone over about a month ago, so maybe you forget. So if you can look back in your notes, or if you can even look in that note sheet, that would be great. 2, are there any amendments that you think are unfair, or maybe an amendment that you think needs to be updated because it's 2020? Once again, think about it and leave some quality comments below. Throughout our history and government choices, government laws, we've pretty much always been divided. You can say that we are divided and polarized today, but there's not many times when we haven't been, really. And you certainly can't say it's been its worst. But then and now, we still struggle with interpreting what things mean. We still struggle with whether laws or government decisions are justified or not, or are they based on the Constitution? This is where the Supreme Court comes in. Lower courts do deal with so much, lower federal courts, state courts, and so on, but the Supreme Court gets the final say. And even then, the Supreme Court can still change decisions or overrule themselves later, such as Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown v. Board of Education, saying that separate but equal is okay, and then no, it is not okay later. Other controversies might include, what does free speech mean? Is everybody allowed free speech? Does that include white supremacists, Westboro Baptist Church? Does that include Holocaust deniers? Does that include flat earthers? Or what does cruel and unusual punishment mean? Is that the death penalty? Or even one of the large controversies today have to do with the Second Amendment and gun control. What do those lines in the Constitution mean? This is where the Supreme Court comes in and they interpret it. So the separation of power and the checks and balances for the Supreme Court specifically have to do with the president actually appointing the justices. Now, the appointment does not mean that you have the job, because they would need to get approved by the Senate. Presidents almost always appoint a justice that is aligned with their own party. In fact, historically, 90% of the time it has gone to the same party. A lot of times it does take the Senate a while to come around to approving a presidential appointment. Another example of a check is that Congress gets to determine the size of the Supreme Court. For instance, the Supreme Court used to only have 5 justices, but now they have 9. It is possible that we could have more. Teddy Roosevelt won at 15, but that is determined by Congress. These justices do serve for life unless they are impeached, which is just the trial, right, by the House, and then the Senate would determine if they're guilty or not, and then what does that mean if they are guilty? Out of the 9, there is 1 Chief Justice, and then 8 associate justices. And one last thing, there is no special requirement. They do not have to take a test or have a certain job, but historically most of them have been lawyers, and that makes sense. Here's an image of our current Supreme Court. Most of them did come from a lower level of the federal court. In fact, 10 of the last 16 Supreme Court justices did actually come from a lower federal court. Once again, this is the highest court. They are mostly a court of appeals that sees other cases from other lower levels of federal courts, but sometimes they do get cases that shoot right up to the Supreme Court. Their role overall is to determine whether the laws or actions are constitutional or not, and they can also remand cases. Remand just means send them back to a lower court. Most of the time, their decision is final, but there has been times that they would overturn their own decisions. One of the biggest powers associated with the Supreme Court is judicial review, which allows them to determine if a law or like a government action, let's say a president's decision, is actually constitutional or not. If they decide this law passed by Congress or President Trump has done something that they think is not aligned with the Constitution, then that action or that law is declared unconstitutional. Interestingly enough, their power is not written in the Constitution. For instance, one of our government framers, Alexander Hamilton, would write, "The executive branch carries the sword, the legislative branch controls the purse and sets the rules, but the judicial branch does neither." So what power do they actually have? They don't have an army, they can't make laws, but they just get to say at the end of the day, this is right or this is wrong based on our Constitution. So again, this power of judicial review was not written down in the Constitution, but it has become an accepted norm from John Marshall. He was a Chief Justice in the famous Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison, where essentially they just give themselves that power. They just make it up, and everybody accepts it. And what they rely on, where they get their power, is essentially just the public's respect and the government's respect for that historical decision. So along with that and their reputation, they have granted themselves judicial review still today. The next question is, how do they choose their cases? The Supreme Court today gets something like 8,000 cases a year, but they actually only get to review maybe around 100 to 130 a year. They try to pick the top priority cases that have to do with the Constitution, and they do need at least 4 of the 9 justices to agree to take the case. They can also remand a case, which just sends it back down to the lower courts. If the case does get sent back to the lower courts, then that also means that the lower court's decision is still in effect. During these cases, lawyers do have 30 minutes to present their case, and then after, justices do review everything, all of the court documents from before, and this takes hours, sometimes even days. They do all of this in a private meeting, and then they do need a simple majority, 5 out of the 4 justices to agree. Then after, they bring out their verdict. So lots of cases do just get dismissed or they're in limbo. You could have somebody spend their entire fortune to try to get the Supreme Court to look at their case, and then they could just ignore it. Sometimes when the justices do refuse a case, it might not be that it isn't a priority, but maybe that they're not equipped to deal with it at that time. The justices do recognize that sometimes certain issues or cases are too hot for their time period, that they're too controversial. Maybe they need a later Supreme Court to deal with that issue. They might be too divided themselves, that they think the best thing to do is just leave the prior decision from a lower federal court as is. During the lawyer's 30 minutes, there is a light that goes off when there's 5 minutes left. Then when the red light flashes, the lawyer has to stop then and there. During these cases, or at least more recently, sometimes you have lawyers giving their speeches, giving their arguments, and you have justices just having conversations with each other right in front of the lawyer, which obviously wouldn't make the lawyers happy. We've even had accounts that the lawyers are doing a poor job or giving poor arguments, and then the justices just outright tell them, like, you're doing a bad job. The justices are also allowed to just freely interrupt. Some justices are more polite than others, and it always depends on the case and the argument. There are no cameras allowed during those 30 minutes, but everything is written down. Sometimes they even take audio of it. There's an artist that does create some images for the public, and not having cameras and not having media involved has also been a debated issue recently. Some justices think it'd be a very good thing, that it would do the public good to have that kind of transparency, but more justices think that it would actually do more harm than good and ruin their reputation. That things that they say in their court cases can be cut up, can be misinterpreted, that media could be disingenuous with that footage. So for right now, they will leave that stuff out. After they do come up with a verdict, the court does deliver their ruling, and they also deliver their opinions. Justices can give concurring opinions, which means that they agree with the final decision, but for different reasons. And then at the same time, justices can give dissenting opinions. So it means that this justice does not agree with the final decision, and here are the reasons why. And this can actually prove to be very useful later. For example, if a similar case goes to the Supreme Court again and then they want to overrule one of their previous decisions, they could point to some of this. During their private meetings, we don't actually know what they talk about. We don't know what's said. We don't know if they're getting along or watching TikTok videos. We have no clue what's going on. But they do leave little notes as reference for us to take a look at later. So I want to wrap this up by giving you some review questions. Number 1, what is judicial review? Number 2, how is the Supreme Court's power checked by the other branches? And at that same time, how does the Supreme Court check the other branch's power? And number 3, you have to do some research for this one. Can you give some examples of famous cases? And then also provide just a very short summary, maybe just one sentence about what that case included. Thanks for watching, and please participate. Make sure that you guys do leave comments, answer the bell ringer, answer the review questions, and then offer any other questions or comments or feedback that you want. Thanks, guys. Bye.